Welcome back to Monday Mod Tips. I'm Captain Xavier, and today we're going to be doing a full disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Vulcan EBF-25. EBF because it was an electric belt-fed blaster, 25-round belts, and this has the distinction, as far as I know, of being the only belt-fed electronic springer. Now, there are a plethora of electronic springers from back in the day, as well as new ones coming out all the time. We call them AEBs now. Things like the Stampede, the Inverted Scales, the Sweetheart Storm, the various other ones that have been coming out. This one, in addition to being the only belt-fed one that I am aware of, also has the distinction of being the only one that also had a manual option, which we'll go into when I look at the controls. Now, it did have a very nice folding tripod that just clipped onto the bottom. Deployed, you could use it, lovely. It is just removable, and we're not going to be needing that because we're not going to be disassembling that. It then had a ammo box on the side, which was really nice. Held one 25-round belt. Simply put it in there, close the top, and for manual action, you simply operated the prime, and it would work just fine. You didn't need batteries. It didn't have to, the motor could be completely burned out, and you could still operate this blaster. One thing it doesn't have, which is kind of odd, it doesn't have slam fire. If you pull the trigger and just cycle it, it won't actually engage the catch. It will just cycle the belt. To operate it electronically, you have to turn on the switch, and it would fire. Once it's fully empty, you can then open the top cover and you can reload as necessary. The ammo can does also just come off, and we won't be needing that because we won't be disassembling that either. So that's pretty much it for controls. There isn't any kind of a safety. The only lock really is that this will not open if there is a belt in it, and that is just a purely mechanical. When the belt is in it, it pushes out this tab and it locks. You can force it open if you really need to, but it isn't recommended. It is just spring-loaded. With enough force, you can pull it open if things are jammed badly enough. So there's that. Let's get this thing open. We are going to have to take the priming handles off, and they are not ones that come off easily. Hopefully we don't break anything. We are going to use a claw hammer. It's crude, but it works. There we go. I don't think I actually broke anything. It's easy for the little tabs in there to get broken off. Luckily, it is something that we can 3D print a replacement for, but we will simply set that aside. Next tricky part is getting the carry handle off. These caps are simply held in place by clips. Again, we just need to pop them out. And that will come off. It does have screws, but again, we're not going to take that part all the way apart. There is a cover on the switch. Oh, there's our battery door and our battery housing. The most common thing that is wrong with this, and in fact I had to fix it on this one, is you'll get corrosion in the battery tray. It's very, very common, and then the blaster just inexplicably won't work. I had to clean up the leads a little bit, but I was able to get it to work. The cover for the on-off switch is another thing that is always getting lost. If you can actually find a blaster that has this, you're in luck. And that should be all the easy to remove stuff. Now we have to start taking out screws. On this side of the blaster, the only screw that we have is one for the top panel. Take it out on this side. Oh, they don't want to come out. Get that large screw out, and then there is a piece of plastic that you will need to remove from both sides. And now we can get that top plate off. Now, it is held together with 4 screws. I will go ahead and disassemble it all the way just so we can see the lock inside. The lock is probably not entirely necessary, but I very much recommend leaving it in place, as it does help keep the belt aligned and secure. And this comes off. And in here we have one big spring. A few more screws in here. And this was back when interior screws were commonly a different color than external screws, which was really nice as it made it easy to tell which screws were your internal screws and which were your external screws. And then there's a little button that gets pushed out. It is also spring-loaded, and that is what creates that lock. We'll put all of those parts together, and now we can start on the main body. I am not going to take any screws out of the barrel at this time, and I will explain why, or it'll become very apparent why, fairly quickly. So we're going to start in this upper corner. And most of these are a larger screw than we see in Nerf blasters nowadays. The old N-Strike blasters tended to have a much larger screw, but they did also tend to be more standard. So far, they've all been the same. I may have been wrong. There may have been one more screw on the other side. Nope, only have it on the one side. Okay. Trying. So far, all of the screws have been the same. The exception is going to be the two up here on our sling mount. They are a much smaller screw, and I'm even going to need a smaller screwdriver to get them out. We will also need something sharp to cut the avoid battery leakage warning, which is where your corrosion comes from. Alright, now, oh, I missed one. One down here in the tripod mount. Alright, now that I have all these screws from here back out, I can open the shell up, and you'll see why I didn't take any of the screws out of the front section. And that is because the front section is held in with one screw in here. It is a standard screw. And then the entire barrel section comes off. And this is something people would actually do to minimize this blaster back in the day. They just take this off. It's not necessary. It has no point except to cause potential barrel drag. There are all kinds of parts on here you could take apart if you wanted. They're great for integrations. People do all kinds of stuff with them. There's sections of rail. Thing to know when you're taking this apart, the screws in the top rail and the forward section of the barrel are a shorter large screw. The four down here are the standard screw, and then there are three small ones up here. There are also two washer-headed screws back here holding in little spring-loaded knobs that I believe line up with, yeah, the carry handle. I'm not sure what purpose they serve, but they're there. So we are going to leave this alone because there's really no reason to disassemble it. Alright, now we can take a look at the inside of the blaster, and there is a wire going from one side to the other, which is mildly annoying, but we should be able to deal with it easily enough. It's to one side of the battery tray because it is actually centered. Now we should be able, hopefully, to get that piece out, maybe. Yeah. Just pull it out with a pair of pliers and get that off on that side. This side of the blaster, the only thing we have is the retention mechanism for the belt box. Two standard internal screws. And that comes out. There is a spring-loaded catch. There we go. Don't lose your spring. It likes to sproing. A little cover. And that's it for this side, which is nice. Now we take a look at the interior. The other side. First of all, we can take this off. I'm not 100% sure what it does or what it's for. I think it just protects the battery housing, the rotation mech from the battery housing. But that plate comes off. And all of this is, hypothetically, one, again, monolithic part. There are some screws, standard interior screws we will need to take out. Don't lose the nut for the battery housing. Keep that. We are taking off all of the screws that are holding the interior to the chassis. Take off the other battery lead. Take out the screws holding our lock. So the blaster will not fire electronically unless you have a belt in, unless you disable this lock. That button that we had from before, that is pushing in this switch, which is completing the circuit. And now we can take the interior out, and it looks like we have 2 screws in here that are holding on the kind of the ejection lip on the belt here. Not entirely sure why that's there or necessary, but they have it in there. If you wanted to remove them for whatever reason, you could. Interesting to me that those had to be screwed on rather than molded in. Oh, and that one appears to be glued in. So you know what? We're going to leave those in place. And there's the other half of the shell, completed. That leaves us with this thing. And this is all of it. This is the total of the interiors, of the internals. We've got remarkably little wiring, really. We've got from one lead to a switch, to the on-off switch, to one side of the motor, and then from one side to the motor. That's the entirety of the wiring. It's simpler wiring than you would see in a lot of other blasters. Oh, then sorry, I missed one. It goes to the trigger switch. On switch, trigger switch, and then over. So we're going to take a look at how this works. So here is our manual prime. And that just brings it back. It catches on a regular catch, and we have a regular release here. And as far as that is concerned, it is a perfectly ordinary springer. When it's fired electronically, of course, when we pull this back, it activates the switch, this switch here, and it turns on the motor, and the motor will cycle automatically. And you'll notice that the priming handle doesn't reciprocate when the blaster does electronically, and that's because it's not linked to where that's being pulled through. Other than that, it's going to have a gearbox that's pulling it back and catching it, and then automatically releasing when it completes. What this does not have, that the Stampede has, is this does not have cycle control. There is no third switch, or rather second switch, that is held down while the blaster is cycling to ensure that the blaster continues to operate, even if you let go of the switch, let go of the trigger before it completes a cycle. If you let go of the switch before it completes a cycle, the system will wind back to the resting position. Since this doesn't have a bolt that needs to be open or closed, it doesn't really matter. And the reason it can't have that third switch is because it has manual. If you were to manually prime it and it had that switch, as soon as you started to manually prime it, it would activate that switch and the thing would operate electrically. And so they don't have that for that reason, I assume. There might have been some clever way that they could have gotten around that, but they chose not to. And I really appreciate that they made this have manual, because it's really something that most blasters like this should have, in my opinion. But we are going to get into this. We're going to take this housing apart and hopefully put it back together. There are a lot of moving parts in here. I'm going to start by removing the electronics if I can. So we're going to start by taking off the main motor. We got 2 standard internal screws, and then our motor will simply lift out. We're going to go to this side. It looks like there's 1 screw holding our trigger switch in place. Sure enough, and it will lift out. And then it looks like we're going to have to dig a little bit deeper to get this last on-off switch. But again, you can see that's the that's it. That's all the electronics that are in here. It's a remarkably simple blaster. And it makes it very easy to upgrade because you just have to hook up really one switch. If you want the on-off, you can have it, but you don't need it. You just need to wire one switch to activate this motor, and you're good to go. You could just wire your battery directly to... There's a lot of ways you could do it. So, what's it going to take for us to get to that switch? I think we're just going to have to take this... Oh, looks like just one screw. Yep, there we go. We got a plate here that lifted off. So far, all internal screws have been identical. I like that. We can now take our trigger off. We can take our on-off switch, which does have a rocker plate on there, which is nice. And there are all of the electronics. It's one of the simplest electronic blasters, simplest wiring for an electronic blaster, despite how complicated this is going to prove to be. All right, we have our manual trigger linkage, or it's actually both. It activates both the manual and the full auto. We have our catch plate. I know it's possible to upgrade the internals, but I don't know that I have any idea what spring you would use. Okay, we're gonna keep moving forward and continue to take screws out. Looks like we have a plate here that has gears on it. Yep, we have 3 standard screws in there, and that's gotten us into our gear box. Okay, we're going to get this next slightly pink plate off of here. Start taking the priming bar supports off. These can be seen from the outside, and so I guess they decided to use exterior screws, big heavy ones. These are shorter, so be sure to set them aside. They are a shorter black screw. We have a spring here. It's held on with a screw, and I'm going to leave it on there. It does look like one of the smallest exterior screws again. And then we've got 5 standard interior screws. There would have been a 6th. Oh, there should have been a 6th. I took it out thinking it was one that was holding the internals in. It wasn't. Okay, now we can lift that plate up and out of the way, and we can see some more of the internals in here. Here we see our belt rotation mechanism. Yeah, interesting. Take that spring and ring off. Here we can see the belt rotation, which is just a revolver that goes forward and back as the blaster operates. Oh, interesting. There are 2 different... Oh, huh. 2 different gears. One controlling the belt rotation and one is controlling the actual plunger system. Fascinating. Another thing that when this rotates, it rotates the belt, and then as it comes back, it presses on this tab, which extends the muzzle, the plunger. It's what presses up against the back of the belt to create the breech to actually then fire. So that's fascinating. So we can get that out of there. That is our belt rotation and barrel extension rod. So you're going to flip it over, take out, oh, there's a return spring. Another spring I'm going to leave on there, but that is your return spring for the manual prime. We've got one more large screw holding the other side of that in, and now we can take out our priming rod. This is what the prime connects to, that then links to the plunger tube, and you notice it's not connected, so the plunger tube can move without this moving. So that's how the electronic is able to prime without this moving, without the bolt reciprocating. If you wanted the bolt to reciprocate, all you would need to do is attach this bar to the plunger rod, and then they would actually reciprocate if for some reason you wanted it to do that for aesthetics or cosplay or whatever. There were belt-fed machine guns where the bolt did reciprocate and you could see it, and well, that would look kind of cool. All right, we're getting down to the guts, trying to figure out what all of this does. Because I've never gone this far into a Vulcan before, if I'm being perfectly honest. Looks like we can take the plunger. We'll wait for that. Let's take the rotation mech off. So we've got 2 more interior screws here. And then our rotation mech comes off. The rotation mech is spring-loaded. So it wants to lock into one of the 6 locations. That is all pinned together, so it's not going to come apart. That's one part there. Yeah, just going to go with that. 2 more interior screws holding the paddle that forces the breech forward, or the muzzle forward, whatever you want to call it. The bolt, I guess it's the bolt. Pushes the bolt forward. And that's got a pin in it. And now we can lift the plunger tube and plunger out. There is some more to disassemble on here, so we will keep going. Looks like we've got 2 more screws that hold our gearbox in place. Oh no, the gearbox is built in. That's just the gearbox cover. We don't want to get to that just yet. I'm hoping that's where that went. Right, we're going to take a look at the far side, see what we've got over here. We do have a pin and a roller for part of our prime, which keeps the prime nice and smooth. Well, remember to put that back in. Right, we've got a little screw up here holding a plate in place, which is holding a spring-loaded pin, which, as far as I can tell, is just part of the possibly keeping this in place, or the rocker switch. Probably for the rocker switch. Those are some fiddly bits you don't want to lose. Oh, what on earth does this do? I have no idea. Well, we're gonna figure it out. It's some sort of a disconnect. Disconnecting the gears from the motor, it would seem. And this is the lock that keeps them disengaged. Wasn't aware of that. What do we got going up here? Some sort of lock, it looks like. We'll have to figure out what it locks and unlocks. And in mine, at least, I have 1 black screw here. And it appears to be of a unique size. So I'm going to keep it with the part it came out of. And got another spring and another little part that pops up. And we got a plate here that does not appear to be screwed in place. It appears to just be friction, possibly solvent welded. Definitely solvent welded, so I'm going to leave it in place. So this plate down here, I'm leaving in place. Okay, finally, we're going to take a look at the gearbox. That has more features than I was aware of, so that's already interesting. There is our gearbox, all lubed up. And what I hadn't been aware of before is that the main interrupted gear, the gear that pulls back on the priming handle and then is doesn't have teeth on part of it to release that, can be pressed in and disengaged. We will have to figure out what exactly that does as we reassemble, which we're almost to that part. We've got 1 more section where we can disassemble a little, and that is our plunger system. Because there's a bunch of things screwed on in here. We've got on our plunger rod, the plunger head does screw off. So if you wanted to put a heavier spring in here, which would be perfectly understandable because this is kind of a wimpy little spring. Standard interior spring though. Plunger head comes off. That's your main spring, and that is tragic. And that comes off. There's a plate here that appears to be holding a pair of rollers in place. And finally, we've got our plunger. Got a couple of spring-load bits here, which as far as I can tell are just to create tension against the back of the belt. Again, to create a seal so it can fire the dart out of the belt. And finally, we've got 2 screws here at the end of the plunger tube that's probably holding in the AR. Wouldn't be surprised if it's also solvent welded. And I would be wrong. There is our air restrictor on the end of our tragically small plunger. There's so much room in this blaster, and they gave it such wimpy internals. Alright, we now have it fully disassembled, and as I said, this is the first time I've ever disassembled a Vulcan this far, so now I get to try to figure out how to put it back together. So, let's do this! We're now going to start the reassembly, so we've zoomed in a little bit. Hopefully you'll be able to see what's going on a little bit better. We're going to start with the main frame. So we're going to start with these 2 parts, which is our main frame with our gears all in their proper alignment, their proper setup there. I did not take them out because I think one of them is actually pinned. They're kind of pinned in, so don't take them out. There's no reason to take them out. And then we're going to put the housing on it, and we are going to add 4 of our standard internal screws. One is going to go here on the side of the main gear there. One is going to go directly down from there, and then one on either side. We're now going to flip this over, and we're going to install some parts on the back side, starting in this upper left-hand corner, where we're going to install that spring-loaded pin, this collection of parts. Pin part goes in, pin side down, of course. Then the spring in behind it. It's a little spring, keep your eye on it. And then we have a small black screw. It's the same size as the ones from the sling mount on the exterior. It's the only one that we see inside the blaster, and that's what's going to hold it in place. Almost all of the screws on the inside are the same size silver screws. There is one washer-headed screw, and there are 2 smaller black screws that we only see in the inside in those 2 locations. So for the most part, it's standard internal silver screws, which is very nice. Next, we're going to install a series of locks up here, starting with these parts. We have this kind of linkage with its spring. Spring is going to go towards the right side of the direction we're holding it. Oh, I got it upside down. There we go. So we'll go there, and it can slide back and forth. We're going to have a part that goes in here. The orange part slot is going to go down. There are a pair of slots in here that it rides in. And then we have a cover plate. And the square side is going to go towards the gearbox. The rounded side is going to go forward. And this is where we see another one of those unusual black screws. We have one small black screw, and it goes on the squared end. And that is just because it needed to be a little bit shorter. And so I guess they decided to make a different color. The other side, the rounded side, has a standard silver internal screw. We then have another lock that's going to go on the far side, which involves these 2 parts. Here we have the spring-loaded part. It's going to go in so that the tab points towards that direction. Spring is there, and then we have our cover plate, which does have a peg for the spring to help retain it, and then 2 standard silver screws. The final thing we're going to have on the back is the part that holds that gear that can move, and that's these parts. Here's where we see our one washer-headed screw inside. This is going to, there's a post it goes on, there's a little section that'll catch the spring. It goes on there, like so. And then we put our washer-headed screw to hold it down. We can now flip it back over. And the next thing we're going to install is going to be the belt rotation gear, which is going to go down here on the bottom. These parts. So the gear has a large hole that this orange T-cross piece is going to go down into. And then we have our cover plate, which also has a hole for the peg. And it's going to go on there. 2 more silver screws. Next, we are going to install our plunger system, which means we need to reassemble it. So we'll set this aside for a moment and reassemble those. We're going to start by reassembling the plunger tube, which involves these parts. So we have our AR system, which is the front section, and it will only really kind of fit in like that. Very light spring goes in behind it. And then these two are going to go together. And there is a right and wrong way. There's a flat edge on the plunger tube, and there's a flat edge on this. Those should line up. If you try to put it in the wrong way, it won't lock down all the way. You can see the gap there when you rotate it around. It locks down into place. And then 2 standard screws. Next, we're going to install these spring-loaded items on the side, which help create tension with the belt to create a seal. And that is going to involve these parts. And there is a right and wrong way for these to go. You'll notice there is an extra tab on the plunger tube on one side and not the other. That tab is going to be going down. And we want, while it is down, we want the version of this where the notch on the back is pointing up, away from you. So we're going to put the spring in place. We're then going to hook the spring and pull this forward. And then we're going to put our plate on top of it. And so with the tab down, that should be the orientation of this piece. We're then going to hold it in place with a pair of interior screws. And then we will repeat the process on the other side. We can now set our completed plunger tube aside while we reassemble the plunger rod. The first part of the plunger rod we are going to reassemble are going to be the rollers. So we're going to need this collection of parts. The rollers are also direction specific. If you look at them closely, one side has an indent. You're probably not going to be able to see that on camera. But those indents, those little indented sections should be pointing up so that the wheels lie flat close to the gear, and then our plate is going to go in so that the rounded side goes down, and it should be flush because there's a part that will go into the indent. Single interior screw to hold that plate in place, and that's our rollers reinstalled, which should provide for a smoother prime. We're now going to install the rest. We need these parts. We have our spring kind of block area, and it does have an asymmetric shape, and there is a notch on here. You want to align those two so that this can go all the way down. If you have it rotated the wrong direction, it won't go all the way. Rotate it so that it can go all the way down. We're then going to put on our main spring and finally install the plunger head into the slot and secure it with a single silver screw. We can then assemble these two. The tab, if it's pointing down, the gear should be pointing towards you. That is the correct orientation that these need to be in. We can now set that aside for a moment, grab our main base, and we are going to install this. Gears should be pointed towards the gears, of course. The main thing to line up is right here, kind of in the middle. There is a section where the spring holder gear thing will lock into place. This should be able to move slightly. You may have to move this lock down here down to get it to engage with a tab that's on there. You might just have to pull this back a little bit and then it'll come forward and it will pop correctly into place. Next thing we're going to install is going to be the paddle that pushes the bolt forward when the blaster is primed, and that's these two parts. If you look at this, one side is flat and the other side is kind of arched. There's also, this side is all smooth and this side has holes. The smooth side is going to go this direction. It will fit either way, but it'll only actually function correctly one way. And it's going to go in between these two pegs in the middle so that it goes around our plunger tube. And then we have our pin that will go down through it into the hole and secure it. And you can see which direction that needs to go. The round section goes that way. And again, 2 interior screws. And when you pull on it, it should force that forward, which it should then lock. That lock we installed holds the bolt forward in order to better secure that tension with the belt. If you then pull back on this a little bit, it should unlock it. Correct. And now it's unlocked and it can all go back into position. The next part we're going to install is this piece. This is part of the gear of the belt rotation mechanism, and it's going to come down into the slot on our rotation gear cover plate and is going to interact with the gear itself. And it does have teeth that will interact with the second of our interrupted gears here. That will get pulled back, and that's what forces that forward. Get all of that unlocked again. Make sure everything can move the way it's supposed to. Next thing we're going to install that I probably should have installed earlier is the roller for the plunger rod. This part. There's a pinhole right here above where the plunger rod is, and it's going to go right there. And that will, again, ensure that this is able to roll much smoother because there are a lot of surfaces rubbing on each other, and we want them to roll nicely. Next, we are going to install the manual priming rod, this part. This is the part that allows you to manually prime the blaster. And it is also going to go right down here on top of all the rest of this. It should, there is a hook, kind of a tab right there. That should be in front of this orange cover plate here. And that's going to go right there. Next, we're going to install this part, which is a cover plate, and it goes over our main gear and over all of our various rods here and holds them all in place a little bit better. Just got to get all of the pins lined up, get all of the various rods lined up, get it to all sit down properly, and then we will hold it in place with 3 interior screws. Now we're ready to put on the main shell. We are going to need to put a few more parts on our plunger tube, these 2 parts. It's the return spring and the return spring sort of retention plate. And this retention plate likes to spring, so keep an eye on it. That goes on there. And then finally, our big plate comes on and goes over the top and holds everything properly in place. Make sure it's lining up with that front retention plate, that spring retention plate. And then we are going to put in, it looks like, 6 screws. Now that we have that on there, remember that I left this spring in place. If you did take it off, it is the shorter of the 2. There's a longer one on the other side and then a short one here. They're held on with small black screws. And if we push the belt rotation mech link rod forward, we will see the hook that spring is supposed to be hooked on. So we can hook it. Now that has its return spring, it will pop forward as it is supposed to. Next we need to install this part. which is part of the manual priming system. It goes on the manual priming rod right there and is held in place with 2 standard shell screws. These can be seen from the outside, and so they decided to go with blackened screws, probably because they are a little bit more exposed to the weather, and the blackened screws don't wear or rust as much as the interior silver screws have a tendency to tarnish or corrode. And then if we flip the blaster over, we have a similar thing on the other side. This is going to hook on there and is going to be held in place with a standard shell screw. And then our longer extension spring is going to hook onto it. And that is the return for our prime. There is a hook on this side, but as far as I can tell, there's no spring for it. So I don't know if that's a leftover. Looks like there was probably used to be one that went here, but it doesn't look like it was ever used on this blaster. Maybe it was supposed to, maybe they didn't, maybe they traded it out, maybe it went sprung and I lost it, I don't know. But clearly there used to be one on either side. I guess they decided it wasn't necessary. Who knows? At this point, we can actually take a look at how everything works together. So if we go with a manual prime, as this comes back, it picks up the belt rotation and rotates the belt. It picks up this and forces the bolt forward. You can see the bolt coming forward there to engage. If we go back, it falls back down when it comes forward. Belt comes forward, and it comes all the way back, and at this point it would normally catch, but we don't have the catch in. But we can see how everything has rotated. Now, the reason that that gear slides out of the way, when we come back, you can see this peg comes up. And that is that gear getting forced out of alignment. And what it's doing is it's disconnecting the main gears from the priming rods, from both the priming rod and the belt rotation rod. Those have been disconnected so that it can move freely. And that is so that the teeth don't get sheared when it fires, because this blaster doesn't have, if you recall, this blaster does not have cycle control. So those gears can still be engaged. On a Stampede, it will always stop with the gears disengaged. This doesn't have that, and so they have that manual disengage of the gears that slides the gears completely out of alignment so that those rods can slide on their own, and that way when you manually prime it, it doesn't shear the gears. And then when it moves back forward, it goes back in line, gears pop back up. The locks that we had on this side of the blaster, those get engaged as this comes forward, and it locks this forward, so it cannot go back. It is physically locked into place, and there's plenty of tension on it to create a good seal with the belt. And then when it comes forward, that all unlocks. So this all works fairly smoothly, fairly simply. And now we can, well, we're not going to install the last parts of this yet, because we do have to install part of the wiring to do that. So we are going to hold off on that for now. We are now going to take a look at the shell. Right, now if you went ahead and took the screws out that held the feed lips in, this is where you would put them back in. One of mine was solvent welded in, so I left them both in. And we are now going to install the wiring, because it kind of goes in on the inside and then everything else comes in on top of it. So remember, we had our fairly straightforward wiring loom. We have a battery lead, a lock switch that blaster won't fire if it's not loaded, the on-off switch, the trigger switch, the motor, and then the other lead. We are going to start with the lead that's connected to a switch, and it is going to go here into our battery housing. Simply push it down as far as it will go. We are then going to do some wire management, run this wire down. You can see where the cables, there are slots for the cables. It's going to come in under here and up to where this lock goes. It is then held in place by standard shell screws. And then on this switch goes this part. And it's largely just a cosmetic thing that goes on there. Acts as a plate there. We're then going to run our wires around the back in this general direction. We will finish with the cable management once we get things in place. We're now going to take our main internals and we are going to add the wiring that belongs onto it. So we have the on-off switch. I can figure out how exactly this goes in here. And now that we have that in place, I'm actually going to take a moment and install the rest of the internals here so that I can put the plate on that holds that in place. First thing we're going to install is going to be the catch, this part. And it is direction specific. By the spring, there is a sloped section. The slope needs to go this way so that when the plate comes back, it will push on that slope, push it up, and it'll come down and lock. So the flat side needs to be towards the back. Spring goes up, right there. There is our catch. Make sure it can move up and down. Very good. We then have this part, which is the trigger linkage. This is the disconnect. It does have has a spring. It's going to go right in here. And that is what's going to release the catch. We then, of course, have this part, the trigger. It goes right there. And then last but not least, we have this plate. And it's going to go down on top of all of that and hold everything in place. It will be held in place by 3 standard interior screws. Now that that is secure, we can turn it over and install our trigger switch. There is a tab on the linkage that comes back. That's the direction the button should be pointing towards the front. And it is held in place with a single internal screw. Finally, turn it back over. We can install our main motor. Slot down in place and hold it in place with, you guessed it, 2 interior screws. Before we install the internals, we do need to put in the rest of the belt feed mechanism, these 2 parts. And they kind of need to get installed at the same time. The shorter section, little wedge, is going to towards the front. It'll only fit one way. Put them kind of together and you can drop it down into place. Spring should be pointing towards the front. And that is that. Make sure that the wires are well underneath it and not getting in the way of anything. Seems to be good. We would not want that to catch the wires in any way, as that would be bad. It would cause a jam. We're now going to install our interior parts. Again, making sure the cable management is correct. And this sprocket is going to connect into the back of that wheel. And then the whole thing should lie down again. Check your cable management. You will need to make sure everything is getting in where it needs to be and isn't getting pinched or isn't in the way of any moving parts. It should go in easily. And then you can get the trigger in place, make sure it moves. Try priming it manually. Yep. Everything is rotating as it should. And now we can secure the interior with, should be, the remainder of our interior screws. Don't forget this part. The battery door bolt goes right there. Next, we are going to install the barrel, the whole barrel section. So this is where you need to make sure that that cable up front is down in those slots, because this ring here on the edge, that's going to go down into that slot, kind of push it down into place. Should pop into place, and then we have a single large exterior screw that holds it down. They wanted a nice beefy screw for this, I guess. And that's good. Now we're going to deal with the other side. So we're going to set this aside for a second. On this side of the shell, we do have one thing to install, and that is the catch mechanism for the belt box, which involves these parts. We have this little part. It's got a tab on one side. That tab is going to go down, And this is a little tricky to install, and be very careful because this spring is wont to sproing, as I discovered when I springed mine across the room. This is in fact a replacement spring that I'm hoping is heavy enough. We're then going to put our cover on, and you guessed it, 2 interior screws. Before I reassemble, I'm going to check and see if that spring is up to the task. Yes. Yes, that's fine. Okay. Now we're going to bring the rest back down, and we're going to install the other battery housing lead. It's going to go in the same way the first one did. Just push down as far as we'll go. And then again, we need to deal with our cable management. It needs to get far enough down to be out of the way of the barrel. There are some channels that you can push it down into so that it will stay down and stay out of the way of all the working mechanisms. Go all the way over to this side. There's one more notch it's going to lock down into, and then you should now be able to sandwich the 2 sides together. Keep an eye on that cable, make sure it's not getting pinched, which it clearly is. Here we go. There we go. Shell should go together easily. And now, exterior screws. We'll start up here. All of the screws on the exterior, with the exception of the 2 in the carry, or the sling mount, are the same size. Before we go any further back, we're going to go ahead and put our on-off switch plate on there. And now we can put the rest of the screws in. We can now set this aside and reassemble the top door, which is going to involve starting with this part. We're then going to need these interior parts. And the rounded area with the 2 grooves, that's going to go down. There's a slot it fits down on right there. We then have a plate, retention plate that sits down on top of it. That is held in with, you guessed it, 2 interior screws. Now we add the pressure plate to these parts. We've got its spring, and then it's got a section with a angled surface that's going to go towards the nubbin, so it pushes it out when it's pressed down. We then have this piece, a plate that goes down over the top, and 4 standard exterior screws. And that is done, and now we can install it on the blaster. It locks down in place, and then we have these 2 parts that lock down into it. They will only go in one direction, and they are held in with our only 2 short external screws, or at least I'm really hoping this is where they went. I probably noted it when I took it apart, and if they were supposed to go somewhere else, well gosh, I'm gonna look silly now, but hopefully I got it right. We can now put our priming rod back in. Make sure that's still working. And our carry handle. Simply locks in like that. And that is the blaster fully reassembled. Manual is still working. Now we just need to see if the electronics will still work after I've torn them out and put them back in again. We will need a belt. Make sure it's turned on. And moment of truth. No. We got no love. Why not? Why you no work? Ah. Aha! The top lid wasn't locked in all the way. It works! Hooray! meant by it doesn't have cycle control. If you only very tap it, it won't go all the way. It will start to rotate, but not rotate completely. And that is a downside, but if it does get jammed at some point, manually cycling it will usually clear the jam. Alright, well that was the full disassembly and reassembly of the Nerf Vulcan EBF25. I hope this was helpful to somebody out there. Survey for what you would like to see disassembled and reassembled next will be over on my community tab, hopefully when I upload this video. Let me know what you'd like to see. Feel free to comment on that survey for blasters you'd like to see on the survey in the future, and we will see if I have them or I'm willing to acquire them to make the video. And as always, thank you guys for watching. Aha! So I made a mistake that I caught during editing where I got the two short exterior screws in the wrong spot, but I might be able to fix it without actually taking the whole blaster apart. At least I'm going to give it a try, because if I don't fix it, I'm not going to be able to sleep tonight. So, we're going to need to pop the priming handle back off. That comes off of there. And we can actually see the two screws that we need to take out. The question is, can I get them out without taking the blaster apart? It looks like they might be just a little too small, but I'm gonna try it anyway. Ah! I got it. And then get the short ones up here. Victory is mine. Now I can go finish editing this and go to bed.